Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Crime Beat Conversations. I'm your host, Rafaella Lipschitz, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Adam Rousselle. Adam is a researcher that looks at illicit financing and weapons technology and runs Between the Lines, which is a platform that investigates the intersection of conflict, illicit financing, and emerging technologies. And in Adam's latest piece for the New Lines Institute, he looks at Chinese money laundering networks and how they often serve as the sort of financial backbone for Latin American cartels. He looks at how Chinese internal capital flight pressures have created this shadow financial infrastructure that can ultimately link Chinese elites to fentanyl networks in the Americas. And today we're going to be looking at the structure, understanding these three tiers that he lays out for us, seeing why traditional enforcement is not hitting the mark and what can be done to really get at this infrastructure. Thanks so much for joining me today, Adam.
Thank you for having me, Rafi.
So I want to start with just sort of understanding the structure. You present this three-tiered framework. Can you walk us through each tier and what it means?
Yeah. So this three-tiered framework I've come out with applies to multiple cases, but it applies quite cleanly to this one particularly. And it takes you back to the supply and demand at source. So tier one happens inside high stress jurisdictions, and in this case, it's China. So I've lived in China. I've studied its economy quite closely. Long story short, asset prices are not stable, and the political system is increasingly less stable for high net worth individuals, and many are under extreme pressure to get their money out. Um, this has coincided with an explosion in fintech technology over the past decade or so that has dramatically increased capital mobility. So it's not just fintech; it's things like messaging apps, um, logistics corridors. It's very much a byproduct of globalization, but at the end of the day, what we have is this huge demand to move money out and this multi-billion-dollar sector to service that demand. And at tier three, you have bad actors. And in this instance, it's the cartels. And they are taking advantage of this globalized money services sector the same way people on the other end in China are. But they're able to supply vast sums of bulk cash to the system. And that's exactly what people in China need. Their primary demand is for US dollars. And so by splitting it into those three tiers, it helps people kind of get their head around the spine of this emerging parallel system.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And I'm wondering if you could help explain sort of some of the logistics of this, particularly these mirror transfers, which, are an important part of this framework and of this shadow system. How do these things actually work?
It's remarkable in its elegance in a way. Um, so if you're a wealthy individual in, say, Shanghai, and you want to move $2 million worth of renminbi out of the country, uh, you're capped at $50,000 to do that, right? So if you're a high net worth individual and you can only move $50,000 a year, that's really not going to cut it for getting the family fortune out. So what you do is you contact a broker. Now, for decades, China has had a vast underground financial services sector known as shadow banks that service debt markets for all sorts of things, primarily the real estate sector, which has since hit extreme turmoil. And so these underground bankers are able to pool large sums of liquidity in renminbi. So if you're that wealthy Chinese person, you contact one of these brokers, they contact people on the outside. And that's where the next end of the chain is. So At tier one, it's you hand your $2 million off to a broker. Uh, then at tier two, that happens in the United States. Someone in the cartel has $2 million in cash. They take a fee from that, usually 0.5 to 2%. And then they take that bulk cash, launder it through various businesses, and distribute it into the accounts of the wealthy Chinese. And now you're thinking, well, the money hasn't moved out of China yet. And that's exactly the case. So once you have that pool of renminbi in China, the cartel in Mexico gets a trade credit and they can purchase anything they need through this. So if they need fentanyl precursors, pill presses, uh, rubber bands for packaging all the money they make, they can buy it from there. They can also buy high ticket consumer items like electronics and sell those in Mexico through front companies for clean cash. And so that's how the value gets moved out of China without renminbi ever leaving the shores. And that's how cartel finance has morphed into these multi-billion dollar operations that are legitimizing vast sums of dirty money.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, you answered my next question, which was going to be the sort of interesting dynamic we're seeing where cartels can actually use the system to purchase their own sort of operational inputs, like the precursors, the pull presses, things like that. It is
Yeah,
a really elegant and fascinating system.
it is um, worth noting. So we're seeing a decline in fentanyl usage and fentanyl, and we know this because fentanyl deaths in the United States are down about 34%. Um, I want to state clearly that this isn't just about fentanyl, that this laundering infrastructure can just as easily launder cocaine money and offset those precursor purchases for more electronics or more of anything that can be resold in Mexico, which is a country of 135 million people with a pretty fast growing economy thanks to American friendshoring.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. And just getting more at sort of the source of the issue, this capital flight pressure in China. Beyond this, what other issues is this pressure creating around the world?
So I've seen a lot of analysis that touches on the tier two and the tier three. So the tier two are, your facilitators, and tier three are your bad actors. And I see less linkage, people talking about the linkages to China. And I think this is very important. So when we look at the rise of industrial scam hubs in Southeast Asia,
Mm.
um, the people that control these are almost exclusively of mainland Chinese origin. They are trafficking in mainland Chinese people, and they are making proceeds off of people from primarily inside mainland China. Now they've expanded to victims in like Thailand, Malaysia, etc. But mainland China is still the bulk of that, and that means that if you're a Chinese person who's been scammed, you're giving your renminbi to someone, right? And so that renminbi is leaving the country and getting down to these scam hubs and converted into crypto somehow. And so somehow it is likely getting in through the Hong Kong market where the over-the-counter brokers move a lot of money down that way. And I think we need to look at that as a real vector of Chinese capital flight enabling militarized scam hubs, alternate cities. We know that like Chinese government investment almost certainly inadvertently has gone to funding the construction of these scam hubs. That's a big one. And this is such a large global multinational services market that we've already seen, like, for example, the Houthis moved about $39 million through Huiwan, which is a multi-billion dollar services market that's still operating out of Cambodia despite major enforcement actions against it. So this is this is a parallel liquidity ecosystem that doesn't have know your customer limitations and could potentially be accessed by some very, very bad actors, not the least of which would be the Sinaloa and cartel and the CJNG, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And just taking a look at sort of how we react to this and the enforcement around this and combating it. You say in your piece that, things like seizures or arrests and things of that nature don't get at the actual infrastructure. How do we
Mm.
try to get at this very complex multinational system?
I guess the elephant in the room as of the day we're having this conversation is the turmoil that's happening in Mexico right now, right?
Hmm.
We have the uh, elimination of El Mencho, the head of the CJNG, and now the CJNG is inflicting violence and mayhem across much of the country. I'm not here to take a political or policy stance on the more than 20 years of militarized war against the cartels in Mexico, but I am saying that we need to go up further in the chain into this three-tiered architecture. So, as I mentioned at tier one, evidence suggests that China cracked down on fentanyl exports at some point, and that's a positive development. Although we can't rely necessarily on foreign governments to follow through on all of this, that is at least a positive development happening at tier one. Tier two is that real choke point, and we're seeing enforcement certainly take big pieces out of it. I mean, this October, we had a $15 billion asset seizure of a money laundering organization known as the Prince Group that was operating out of Cambodia. That's the largest digital asset seizure in history. Um, we are seeing the emergence of a blockchain analytics industry that is starting to get a sense of crypto flows. And crypto is a very big part of this simply because of its low friction and ease of access. But the thing about crypto, and this is where a lot of analysis um, kind of throws up its hands, it says that it's so big we can't control it. But the flip side of that is that every single transaction, even the anonymous ones that happen in a on a blockchain, are visible in all perpetuity. And so it's a matter of mapping and tracing. So that combined with, and I've talked about this with machine learning applied to dealing with all these massive data points, shows some hope in this regard. The same kind of thing is for compliance, bank compliance. I mean, we had $3.1 billion in fines paid by TD Bank in 2024. That's like a third of their annual profits that year. Banks are starting to beef up compliance in this regard. So there's a lot of things that are happening at the tier two level to combat this facilitation layer. But of course, it's a huge problem and a really pretty new field of inquiry, at least in this incarnation. It requires a lot of deep research and mapping and coordination moving forward. But going after this from a logistics perspective makes sense because wars are almost never won with bullets and missiles alone. They're won on superior logistics. And that's really where disruption has to happen, I think.
Mm, absolutely. Well, Adam, thank you so much for chatting with me today about this, fascinating but
Thank you for
very
having me.
complex system that you've laid out for us. And thanks everyone for watching this episode of Crime Beat Conversations. Be sure to stay tuned for more, and Adam's latest piece will be linked below. Thanks so much.